All right, we've got Mara, daughter of the Nile, chapter 24. For Egypt is the title. Nuit, the starry one, goddess of the sky, arched her spangled body over the land of Egypt and gazed down serenely on its sleeping thousands. In palace and villa and hovel they slept, long of eye, with their amulets about their necks, each stiffly pillowed on his headrest of wood or carven ivory or gold. The sailor slept on his vessel in the Nile, and the priest in his temple cell, the beggar in his lane. The scent of lotuses and the river and the black earth rose like the very breath of night to delight Nuit's nostrils. And the cat slept, and the waterfowl slept, and the dead slept in their spices and wrappings deep in the tomb. But not everyone slept. In Bubastis in the north, a thief prowled the night. In Abydos, 3 surgeons worked over an old man who moaned in pain. And in Thebes, 2 men argued in tense and urgent whispers in an alley. The eyes of Nuit rested on these 2 with mild curiosity. One was young, dressed as a scribe, the other a burly riverman. They seemed agitated and in anxious haste. Presently, they left their alley and moved swiftly, but with great caution, down another, glancing always from side to side as if searching for someone. Nuit became aware that there were other dark figures scattered throughout the alleys and byways of this particular area, hiding in 2s or 3s, sometimes venturing forth, also searching until they found others. The scribe discovered one such group, joined it eagerly, and gave whispered orders, then hurried with his companion toward the river. There was a small papyrus boat bobbing against one of the ladders of the wharf, which Nuit had not deemed worthy her notice until the scribe and the riverman dropped into it and paddled in silent haste out across the Nile. The eye of Nuit was distracted. So remember, Nuit is the starry one. It's the goddess of the sky. So they're kind of telling the story like she's looking down and watching everything happening in this part of Egypt. There was a small, the eye of Nuit was distracted. For a time she was engaged in admiring her own starry reflection in the dark mirror of the water. When she remembered the 2 men, they were already scrambling up the opposite bank and starting at a run through the streets of western Thebes. At a corner within sight of the palace wall, near a clump of acacia trees, they halted, held a brief conference, then separated. The riverman melted into the thick shadows under the acacias. The scribe made his way by lane and back alley into the district of great walled villas to the northwest. He was moving with the utmost caution now, and he grew wearier the closer he approached a certain broad street lined with sycamore figs. And in a state of noble proportions which fronted on it, Nuit was pleased. The sycamore was sacred to her, and its glassy leaves mirrored her own beauty, as well as emitting the delicate, sharp scent most welcome to her nostrils. Because of the sycamore, she looked with favor on the estate, whose walls the scribe was circling stealthily, and smiled when he scaled the wall by means of its vines, slipped through a corner of the large date grove, and approached the great columned, silent house set in its midst. She watched him until he gained an inner courtyard by the servant's wing and knocked softly on a door. Then the faint cry of a woman in Memphis reached Nuit's velvet dark ear, and remembering her duties as a protectress of mothers in childbirth, for was she not the mother of great Osiris himself? She turned her attention to another drama. "Irinaman," whispered Sheftu, knocking again and more insistently upon the door. There was the sound of a startled movement within, then the old man's voice. "Who's there at this hour of the night? Wait, I'm coming." In a moment, the door was opened, a cautious crack. Then it swung wide, revealing an Irinaman who looked strangely shrunken and frail, as bald as an egg, without his eye paint and elaborate wig. "Your lordship," he gasped. "What is—" "Hush! Let me in quickly." Sheftu stepped into the room and silently closed the door, while the old man fumbled to light a lamp. Irinaman, has anyone been here tonight? Have you been disturbed? Nay, my lord, none but that Midianite trader earlier this evening, come peddling his wines as he does every... No one else? You have seen no soldiers about? Soldiers? Indeed, no. What would soldiers... The lamp glowed into brightness now, and Irinaman turned to study his master's face by his light. Your lordship, is there trouble? Does it mean something is wrong? That no soldiers have been here? Nay, it means all that is unbelievably right, as yet. Oh, Ammon, it means I have made a terrible mistake, perhaps a fatal one for a maid who still keeps silent even at this moment, under I know not what punishment. Quick, Irinaman, arouse one of the grooms. I want Ebony and the black mare hitched to my chariots within 5 minutes and ready in the main courtyard. Sheftu caught up the lamp from the old man's table and, shielding a flame with his hand, dashed through the servant's wing into the inner garden and up the stairs to the second floor of the main house. Once in his own room, he tore off his coarse scribe's garments and put on fine linen ones with his costliest jeweled collar and a golden headcloth. By the time he reached the main courtyard, the blacks were harnessed and tossed their silken heads. Seizing the reins from a sleepy room, Sheftu leaped into the chariot and snatched the whip from its holder. Your lordship, take care, begged Irinaman, in a quaking voice, gripping the side of the chariot with both hands. I fear for you. May I know where you are going? Ay, and you may know as well as I may never come back. I go to the palace, old friend, to stick my head in a noose. Pray to the Shining One that it will not tighten too soon. Sheftu leaned to grip the old man's hand, then he popped his whip and the chariot plunged forward amid a clatter of hooves, spun out of the imposing gates and down the street of sycamores toward the palace. In Menfi the baby had been born, a tiny child yelling lustrously in the Egyptian night. Already the mother had tied a protective amulet around his wrist, and the father was hurrying to burn a pinch of incense for Nuit, the great mother, in gratitude for the safe birth. As its fragrance drifted upward to the nose of the starry one, she smiled serenely and allowed her lustrous eyes to move again to Thebes. She could not find the scribe now. In the great villa under the sycamores, she saw none but an old man in night-clothes standing alone by the gates with his bald head bowed in his hands. However, there was movement far away down the dark street, swift and reckless movement, and the clamor of hoofs. It was a chariot driven full tilt by a young noble in a collar that rivaled Nuit's own star-gemmed throat, and his horses were black as her hair. She watched him with interest as he sped through one street and then another, and upon rounding the last corner beside the palace walls, pulled up short beside a clump of acacias she thought she remembered. Ay, it was the same, for out of its dark shelter darted the river captain, who held a hurried conference with the nobleman, then set off at a lumbering trot around the curve of the palace wall. The other whipped up his horses and drove straight for the main gate. His voice, bold and demanding, floated faintly to Nuit's faraway ear, and in a moment the palace gates swung open. At his barked order, the sentry snapped to attention, raising his sword to salute as the chariot flashed past him and whirled down the east avenue. The starry one had seldom encountered a more impetuous young man, and she found herself pleased by him. She wondered where she had sent the riverman and to what purpose. After a brief search, she discovered the captain some distance to the west, pounding heavily at the door of the long barracks which housed the pharaoh's bodyguard. His answer was the flare of a lamp within, then the door swung open. Nuit blinked rapidly at the light, causing 1,000 stars to twinkle. To her disappointment, the captain stepped into the lighted room where her night-seeing eyes could no longer follow him. General Khofra, panted Nakonk. I am he. What is it, man? I bring the signal. Lord Sheftu's orders to be obeyed tonight at once. He bids you rouse your shoulders. At the mark of 4 exactly, they're to march on the palace, overpower the sentries first, and leave enough archers at the gates to hold off the regulars should they try to bring aid. Then... Stay a moment, burst out the general incredulously. Tonight? The revolution's to take place tonight? At the mark of 4, no later. Hearken. Once in the palace, you're to send a detachment to the king's apartments while you storm the throne room. Take plenty of men for that. We think the room's full of regulars. You've just half an hour. Hasten. You must be mad, my friend. I can't do it that fast. The gods willing you can, bellowed Nakonk. By Ammon, you must. Lord Sheftu's walked into the lion's jaws, and he'll die like a trapped rat if you don't bring it off. He may anyway. Nakonk jammed his wig down more firmly onto his head and reached for the door latch. What of the other factions? What of the other factions? Barked Khofra, who in spite of his protests was hurriedly buckling on his leather tunic. The priesthood? The nobles who've sworn loyalty? The common folk? Have they been roused? That's where I'm going now, to rouse the nobles. I've comrades across the river doing the rest. By this time, the queen's highest priest has fallen. If all's gone well, and there'll be a procession out of the temple at dawn, followed by the populace. They'll do their parts, never fear, but without your seasoned troops. They're far from seasoned, Captain, said the other grimly, seizing his helmet from the chair. The thing's impossible, but by every god in Egypt, I will do my best. Luck go with you. Nakonk plunged out into the night again as Khofra vanished down the hall of the barracks to rouse his soldiers. Nuit did not see the captain emerge, for she was watching the young man in the shining collar. He had abandoned his chariot near the palace stables and set off at a run through the maze of gardens and courts. Ahead in the direction he was running lay the north wing of the Golden House and the great hall where the woman, Hatshepsut, she who arrogantly claimed descent from Nuit's own glorious grandfather, Ra the Shining One, was accustomed to hold her audiences. Something was happening in that hall, something ugly, but there was too much torchlight for Nuit's dark, loving eyes to make out what it was. She felt a flicker of apprehension, quite unsuitable to a goddess, but she perceived that her bold young man was making straight for the anteroom that adjoined the hall. He passed into the midst of light that surrounded the portals. Then to Nuit's disappointment, he, like the captain, vanished through a torchlit door. She shrugged her starry soldiers. These scurrying mortals had amused her, but now she would spend what remained of the hours of darkness in admiring her beauty in the mirror of the Nile. She began to do so, but soon the urgent calling of a woman in the Delta recalled to her mind her age-old duty, and she forgot Thebes as she ushered another new Egyptian into the world. Mara swam up slowly out of her sea of dark oblivion. Someone was splashing cold water on her face and shaking her roughly. They will only beat me again, she thought, keeping her eyes shut. I'll pretend. But even as she planned it, she gasped and cringed as the hand touched her raw shoulder. She's but feigning now, said Nahara. Up on your knees, you. But it was not his voice which forced her eyes open. Suddenly, jarred her whole mind alert. It was another voice, outside in the anteroom, and a stir among the soldiers who stood nearest the door. Up on your knees, I said, repeated Nahara. Then impatiently, what is that? Who's outside there? A noble who demands admittance. Excellence, mumbled one of the soldiers. He seems most... Let him in, commanded Hatshepsut. Mara raised herself to her knees, disregarding the pain the movement caused her. It couldn't be. It mustn't. But it was. The tall doors swung open, and an arrogant, gold-decked figure she had never thought to see again strolled through them and bowed with debonair grace toward the throne. Good evening, Radiant One. Excellencies, rejoice, remarked Lord Sheftu. He did not glance at Mara, nor did she at him. After her first agonized recognition, her attention froze on Sahur, whose sudden intent frown showed that it was only a matter of moments until the jeweled collar and golden headcloth would no longer confuse him. Had Sheftu noticed him? He must have, and he must be all but reeling from the shock of it. Why did he come? Thought Mara. Whatever plan he'd had in mind, it was defeated before it began. You might rather say good morning, the queen said, remarking irritably. Have we turned night into day, or is it your habit, Lord Sheftu, to visit the palace at this hour? I suppose this audience was secret. Your Radiance, it is difficult to keep anything secret in the city of Thebes when both servants and rivermen gossip like magpies, often with each other. I felt my place was by your Majesty's side. However, the smooth voice took on a note of amusement. I seem to have overestimated the emergency. Where are the criminals, daughter of the sun? Surely my lord Nehereth's adroit and fearless coup netted more than one wretched slave girl. A poor catch indeed, but all we have, returned the queen, frowning at Nehera, who had gone red with anger. And the stubborn wench has told us naught. Perhaps she knows not, suggested Sheftu carelessly. But whether she be innocent or guilty, your majesty has been ill-advised on the manner of questioning her, he added with a glance of Senmut. The maid looks half dead. Should she defy Pharaoh and go unpunished? Snarled Senmut. Nay, but on the other hand, what of value is her corpse? Mara listened breathlessly. By Ammon, already he had contrived to make the whole matter seem vaguely ridiculous, and the Count and Lord Nehereth a pair of fools. Could it be possible that... Then she glanced at the juggler and her heart sank. His narrow eyes were gleaming. He had realized the truth. But would he dare accuse so great a lord? He could prove nothing. If your majesty will allow me, Sheftu was saying easily, I might soothe the maid a little, tempt her with some small reward. Nay, we've tried that. My majesty offered her both gold and freedom. She scorned them. She scorned them? Sheftu was not acting now, and there was a note in his voice that stirred Mara to a deep, unreasonable joy, as if he could not believe what he had heard. He repeated, She refused a bribe? Ay, she did, the wretch. There was a little silence, and when Sheftu spoke again, his voice shook almost perceptibly. In that case, naught on earth can unseal her lips. Perhaps, after all, she knows nothing. And perhaps she knows much. It was a new voice, Sahur's. It rang loud and derisive through the room. But you know more, Sashai. Every head jerked toward the juggler, still crouched on his knees, but now pointing a long, accusing finger at Lord Sheftu. How dare you speak without permission? Gasped the queen. Sheftu went on at once, as if good breeding alone forbade him to notice an outrageous interruption. And if she knows not, your majesty... Wait, cried Count Setmut. Let the juggler speak. Did he say Sashai? I did, lion of courage and wisdom. That is Sashai, who stands before you in fine raiment and gold. He is the scribe of the falcon. The same. The queen rose to her feet. What is this babble? Do you know of whom you speak, insolent fool? This is Lord Sheftu, son of Menkaw, the friend of kings and my trusted courtier. He is also Sashai, your magnificence. He is the same, I swear it. Sheftu's amused voice broke in. Who is this madman? He intrigues me. Of course he's mad, cried the queen. He offends my majesty. Take him away, Nehera. Your radiance, wait. Count Setmut stepped forward, and the harsh furrows of his smile deepened slowly in his face as he studied Sheftu. Surely my lord would be even more intrigued if this juggler could prove his claims. That would be amusing, would it not? Speak, juggler. Have you proof? I have, lion of wisdom. The queen stiffened. Nehera pulled the juggler toward him, and Mara caught her breath in sharp and sudden fear. You can prove this accusation? Burst out Nehera. Speak then, quickly. Let his highest excellence, the architect, look upon the left wrist of the great Lord Sheftu. Oh, Ammon, it's over, it's all over, he's lost, thought Mara. And the fragile bubble of hope that had been growing in her burst all in an instant. What will I find there? Asked Count Setmut, moving toward Sheftu stealthily like a great cat. An amulet of strange design, highest excellency. I have not seen it this night, for his wrist is hidden from me, here where I kneel. Nevertheless, I will describe it to you, for I know it well, well from the wrist of Sashai. Describe it then, Senmut seized Sheftu's wrist, and hiding it from the juggler with his own body, stared down at it. It is a twist of flax thread strung with 7 green beads and knotted 7 times. There is a flat bead of carnelian in the midst of the 7, inscribed on both sides. Is it not as I say, Excellence? Slowly, the architect's eyes climbed up to rest on Sheftu's immobile face. It is as you say. He flung Sheftu's wrist down. Here is your traitor, Radiant One, the incorruptible Sheftu. Oh, Cyrus, whispered the queen, dropping back upon her throne. It cannot be. It cannot be. For Mara, time itself seemed to halt. Then Sheftu sighed, shrugged, and turned to Count Setmut. So it is over, comrade, he said. We had best admit everything, had we not? But it was sad that in spite of all of our precautions... We? Senmut was staring at him, suddenly ashen. Great Ammon, what are you saying? Hatshepsut fairly screamed. Do you tell me that Count Setmut, too? The architect whirled to her. Majesty, it is a lie. He but seeks to drag me down with him. Radiant One, you do not believe. Oh, come, put in Sheftu cruelly. The game's over. We've been comrades. Let us die like men. Curse you, you'll die like a rat, here and now. Senmut sprang upon him savagely. A knife flashed upward, only to clash upon another that seemed to leap up of itself into Sheftu's fist. In an instant, the room was pandemonium. Nahara's cloak fanned Mara as he rushed forward. Hatshepsut was on her feet, shrieking orders that brought soldiers flying from every corner of the room. Mara, torn between terror and wild elation, found herself standing erect, hurling defiance at all of them at the top of her voice. Then the knot of the soldiers around the two men burst apart. Nahara staggered back, and there was Sheftu, held fast by two soldiers, with his fine robe torn, but his eyes flashing. On the floor at his feet sprawled the body of Count Senmut. So, breathed Hatshepsut, one is gone, and the other shall follow. Her voice rose with fury. You stand condemned of treason and murder, my lord Sheftu. At sunrise you die. And my secrets with me, taunted Sheftu. The queen's features seemed to freeze. For the first time, Mara saw a glint of real fear in her eyes. What do you mean? There are others? Sheftu laughed softly, and the pharaoh rose as if the sound itself drew her to her feet. Cease this mockery. What secrets? A what? And when is it to happen? And who will do it? Count your hours, Hatshepsut, for there are few left, and you will not enjoy them. Who can you point to now and say with confidence, he is my friend? Your court is full of traitors, and you know them not, but I know them. He is gambling for time, thought Mara, on what frail hope she could not imagine. He was taking one last chance, playing on the queen's one weakness, her fear for her throne, and he was doing it as skillfully as a harpist plucks his string. Hatshepsut was standing rigid with panic in her eyes. What traitors, she cried. Their names die with me. And their plans as well, son of the devourer. What can they do without their leader? My death will be as nothing to them. It will be as a stone thrown into the Nile in the time of inundation. Do the waters stop for a stone? The plans are made, Hatshepsut, and the hour is near. You will know your enemies when they strike. For an instant, Hatshepsut's face was sickening to gaze upon. Then slowly she straightened, and something of her cold beauty returned as she forced herself under control. She sat down slowly, stiffly, and grasped the arms of her throne. Lord Sheftu, she said, let us approach this in a different manner. Why go to your death when you might serve me in Count Setmut's place, when you might own the choice lands that were his, tax-free, when you might be the most powerful man in Egypt? All this I could give you or more, whatever you asked. Surely there is some treasure you crave. Sheftu hesitated, and a gleam of triumph appeared in Hatshepsut's eyes, and at last he said, there is majesty. The queen let out her breath slowly and relaxed, leaning back with a faint smile twisting her lips. Soldiers, release his lordship, she commanded. The men loosed their hands and stepped back. Sheftu stood free. At once he strode quickly to Mara and took her into his arms. Mara, in a rapturous confusion at the unexpectedness of it, barely heard the queen's outraged explanation. But she felt with all her heart the gentleness with which Sheftu held her, taking care not to touch her blood-stained shoulders, and she heard his murmur in her ear. "O Mara, my beloved Mara, I would I could save thee, but they come not, and it will soon be too late." "Who comes?" she whispered, but the queen's mocking laughter cut in. "This is your treasure, Lord Sheftu?" "Ay, the greatest treasure in Egypt, a maid whose loyalty cannot be bought. Whatever bargain we make, daughter of the sun, must include her freedom." Mara did not see what signal the queen made to the soldiers, but suddenly she and Sheftu were jerked apart and held fast, and Hatshepsut was on her feet, her voice lashing at them. "We will make no bargain, Nahara. Bring forth your Libyan and instruct him to beat this maid to death before his lordship's eyes. Unless, did you wish to speak, Lord Sheftu?" Mara flashed him a terrified glance and saw that Hatshepsut had found her weapon at last. All Sheftu's cool poise had shattered in an instant. He was fighting his captors like a madman, though his lips were shut tight. "Begin," Libyan ordered Hatshepsut. The lash curled through Chadzar's fingers like a lazy black serpent, then struck. The pain was nauseating. Through it, Mara heard Sheftu's furious voice, and though she could not understand what he said, she screamed out, "Don't speak! Don't speak! It will not last long." It would not last long at all, she thought dimly as the lash came down again. Already the blackness was closing in. She had had too much. After the next blow, she would feel nothing. But the next blow never fell. For an instant, she could not distinguish the strange new sound she was hearing from the roaring in her own ears. Then she realized this new roar came from outside. Men were running, shouting, and suddenly Hatshepsut was crying out orders in strange, hoarse voice, and Mara felt herself dumped like a discarded burden as the soldiers leaped over her and ran. The big doors burst open. Mara struggled painfully to rise, staring about her at the wildest confusion. Soldiers were everywhere, pouring into the room in endless streams, clashing in hand-to-hand combat with those ranged around Hatshepsut, who stood screaming orders before her throne. Nahara fell as Mara watched, and the gnarled old general who had struck him down whirled as the juggler crept past the inner doors, seized him, flung him bodily into the arms of two archers. A shadow fell across her. "Mara, O Ammon, no hand but mine shall slay that misbegotten Libyan." "Mara, O Ammon, no hand but mine shall slay that misbegotten Libyan." Sheftu scooped her up, cursed incoherently, carried her to the far side of the room, and thrust her into a pair of strong and sheltering arms she recognized with wonder as Nakonk's. As Sheftu whirled away again, she heard the captain's comforting growl in her ear. "Now, little one, all's well at last. Everything's out of your hands. Our task is done. Rest, little blue eyes." He flung his cloak about her, and with a deep sigh of gratitude, Mara buried her face in the rough folds of his tunic and shut her ears to the noise of conflict and shut her eyes. When she opened them, she knew not how much later. All was strangely quiet. She twisted about in Nakonk's arms, which instantly loosened, and for a moment had the peculiar sensation that she was back with Anani in Hatshepsut's formal court. Once more the big room glittered with the jeweled collars of courtiers, but now the walls behind them were lined thick with soldiers, those wearing the scarlet helmets of Pharaoh's bodyguard. The courtiers, headed by Sheftu, stood in two ranks down the length of the room. At one end of the open aisle thus formed was the dais, the great throne, and Hatshepsut standing motionless and stiffly erect, with her black hair falling into a cloud about her cold and beautiful face, and the cobra on her brow. At the other end, approaching her with the stride of a conqueror, came the long-fettered king. Thutmose stopped before the throne and spoke, "Come down." There was a pause during which not a head moved, not a finger stirred. Then slowly Haughtily, Hatshepsut descended the stairs of the dais and stood before him. He reached out and jerked the coronet of Egypt from her head. Then, still without turning his eyes from her, he beckoned someone in the crowd. A servant stepped forward bearing a tray on which rested a golden cup full of some dark liquid. For just a moment, Hatshepsut's gaze wavered as she looked at the cup. Then it returned unflinchingly to Thutmose. "You show little mercy, half-brother," she said bitterly. "I show much. I grant you leave to die by your own hand rather than another's. Take the cup and drink." Hatshepsut was silent, and the mask of youth fell suddenly from her face. "So be it. I will drink and forget. But you will not forget, nor will these others, though you chisel my cartouche from every monument in the double kingdom. My works stand, son of the lesser wife, and they will eclipse yours and your son and those of all pharaohs after me. So long as the land of Egypt is watered by the Nile, you cannot kill the name of Hatshepsut the Glorious. Now give me the cup. But I am Pharaoh, and I will not drink it here in the presence of my enemies. Stand aside that I may pass." With a sweep of her fragile, flowing robes, Hatshepsut turned and bore the golden cup to her private chambers. Thutmose followed her. The door closed quietly behind them. A sound like a sigh passed through the crowd in the throne room, but no one stirred from his place, though Sheftu turned to seek Mara's eyes across the space that separated them. It seemed a long time before the inner door opened again, and Thutmose stepped forth alone. At sight of the royal cobra on his brow, the entire company fell to their knees. But the king walked straight to Sheftu, raised him, and grasped his shoulders in both hands. There was a low conversation unheard by any save themselves. Then both turned toward Mara, and Sheftu quickly crossed the place of blood-stained floor and took her hand. "Beloved, come with me, unless your hurt is too great." Conscious of 100 eyes upon her, Mara followed him painfully, but with pounding heart down the double line of kneeling courtiers to the king. "So," said Thutmose in the gentlest tone she had ever heard him use, "it is the little interpreter who has saved Egypt and me this night." He was silent a moment, then lifted his hand to touch his lips and forehead in the salute of respect. "Blue-eyed one, never again shall you cover your shoulders. I declare your scars to be medals of gallantry, greater than any I could bestow, and it is my will that all the black land look upon them and learn the nature of courage." Gravely, he lifted a massive gold chain from his own neck and placed it around Mara's. "Count Sheftu," he added, raising his voice so that it carried to all parts of the room. "I advance your status to nearest friend and advisor of the pharaoh. Your place is at my right hand as long as I rule Egypt. But I charge you now, leave me and find the most skilled physician in Thebes to treat this maid's wounds. Farewell, and the gods go with you." He turned away from them, and as they moved once more down the long room, they heard his confident and vigorous step advancing toward the throne. A moment later, in his voice rang out, "In the name of Ra, the shining one of my pharaoh, whose royal will decreed it, I claim my heritage as pharaoh of the two lands and sole ruler of Egypt." That concludes chapter 24 of Mara, Daughter of the Nile. We have one more chapter left.